pleasure today to have Benji Backer on our University of Texas Energy Symposium. Before I introduce him, I will let you know what's upcoming. So first, I'm Carrie King, Assistant Director of the Energy Institute here at the University of Texas at Austin. And thank you for joining us for the University of Texas Energy Symposium. The upcoming two talks that we will have today of the next 2 weeks are about CO2 capture effectively. So we'll have our own Fred Klussman, who's a research associate here at UT, talking about lowering the risk of commercialization of CO2 capture. Perhaps Benji might have an opinion on this. And then we'll have Tim Dixon 2 weeks from now, who's the general manager of the greenhouse gas program at the IEA. So we'll kind of have a CO2 heavy next couple of weeks after this. But today it's a pleasure to introduce Benji Backer, who's the executive chairman and founder of the American Conservation Coalition, or ACC, which he states is the largest right-of-center environmental organization in the country. He's here. He's the author of a new book, The Conservative Environmentalist, Common Sense Solutions for a Sustainable Future. He's a graduate of the University of Washington. He's awarded the Fortune under 40 under 40, the Forbes 30 under 30, and the GreenBiz 30 under 30. So, and the Grist 50. We can tell us what that is. So he serves on the board of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Climate Change Commission, the Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum. He's from Wisconsin, and BridgeUSA. And he's a contributor to media outlets, and he's been hitting the circuit here on The View and other places discussing his book. And his book, roughly, is about solving the climate crisis from a conservative standpoint, and saying this is a key, solving the climate crisis is key to American national interest as well. So, as he might discuss with us, politicians, pseudo-experts, other partisans have led us to believe that there are only two approaches to climate change, which is doomerism or denial. But he says, no, there's a better way, and those are dead ends. So today's conversation will be sort of just that, a conversation with Benji. He will speak for something like 5 or 10 minutes, and I will interject some questions and try to have a conversation with him. But this is all to give you, the viewers, time to submit your own questions, and we will be looking at your questions, the question and answer feature of Zoom, as much as we can. And as soon as you can ask them, we will try to address them. So there's going to be not much, no formal presentation, but just a discussion today. So please help us out and submit your questions as they come up. And with that said, I want to let Benji take the floor. Benji, go ahead.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. And I do really appreciate everyone showing up, because I graduated college around the time that Zoom classes and things were happening. I graduated in 2020, and I think the only Zoom event I would have ever attended is something for an energy institute like this, but we didn't have one. So I'm really glad everyone's here, and I'm so glad that UT has such a strong energy institute, because like it said, all the good ideas happen there, start there, and the change making starts there. And so it's going to be an awesome conversation today. I was actually just in Austin over the weekend speaking at the Texas Tribune Festival. And so I'm sorry that we couldn't be in person, but we'll make that happen at some point. As a way of background, I grew up in Wisconsin with a family that had parents that were vegan, conservatives, that were entrepreneurs, and love the environment. And none of those things tend to make too much sense, especially living in Wisconsin, where there's a lot of cheese, and being vegan and conservative. And so I, from a young age, kind of saw how things that don't always go together can go together. And so I was actually active at a young age in politics. My parents leaned conservative, but they weren't conservative publicly. I didn't even really know. So I was the first in my family to be politically active, and I started when I was 10 years old, knocking doors and making phone calls and doing campaigning for candidates that I felt like were standing up for the views that I had at the time. And during that time, I was really starting to fall in love with nature as well. I started to love hiking during that age. I loved started to love skiing during that age and just being outside. You can see skis behind me. That's all my favorite activities are outside in nature. And so when I was starting to think about what that meant politically, I became very frustrated because I paid attention to politics a lot, as I'm alluding to, but I also was noticing that there was a growing partisan divide on the topic that I cared so much about, of the environment and protecting nature. All my projects in high school and middle school I did on climate change and the environment and how to protect it, and that was just kind of something that was a given to me. And so I didn't understand why conservatives weren't at the table, and that I also didn't really buy into left-leaning solutions as well. So really what that tells you is that at the end of the day, no matter where I sit politically, I believe that the environment and climate change should be a nonpartisan issue. And I would think most people who are Gen Z or millennial believe that too. And I would even argue that most older people believe that. There was a study done in 1990. Well, there's a study done every year that Gallup does that says who self-identifies as an environmentalist. And in 1991, the number was over 80%. Today, the number is a strikingly low 39%. And so the question isn't then why does one side hate the environment and the other side, why are they so alarmist about it or so worried about it? The question is, what fueled the partisan divide? What made half of the people who self-identified as environmentalists drop off from considering themselves that, and arguably their leaders stop making policies around that? And my life mission is to help solve that challenge and get that number back up to 80+% so that we can actually get good policy to protect the environment, protect the climate, and also protect humanity at the same time, because there needs to be a balance between all of those things. So my freshman year of college, I went out to the University of Washington in Seattle. So I grew up in Wisconsin, but I went out to Washington because I wanted to be in a place that I could hike or ski every day. And I ended up, doing that pretty frequently when I lived out there. But my freshman year, was actually 2016 when Trump and Clinton were facing off. And I didn't feel represented by either of them on this divide that I'm talking about. So I decided to start my own organization that would basically put conservatives back into the conversation on climate and the environment, so that there was a competition of ideas and that we could actually get bipartisan solutions. Fast forward 8 years, we now have recruited over 150 conservatives to be talking about climate, to acknowledge that it's real, to propose their own ideas in Congress, 150 of them, which is a pretty large number. We've seen, even though the media doesn't really talk about it, a massive influx of bipartisan legislation. Many of those policies have passed and become law on energy and climate and the environment, from everything from like the national parks and funding those, which there was a $13 billion debt that we helped fund during Trump's years in office, to before the IRA, the biggest investments in clean energy and climate ever came with 2 bipartisan bills, one under Trump and one under Biden. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but we are making a lot of progress. And really, at the end of the day, I believe that conservative principles are inherently critical to solving climate and environmental challenges. The conservative side does not have a monopoly on good ideas by any means, but if one side's sitting on the sidelines and the other is leading the narrative, then we don't get the best results. And so I wrote a book that kind of unveils what that policy approach looks like, and we can talk about that a little bit more today if people want to. That basically talks about how rural communities, which have been largely left out of the equation, need to be part of the equation, that markets and innovation need to be a big part of the equation rather than just relying on government, that nuclear energy, carbon capture, hydropower, more efficient fossil fuels need to be a part of the equation, not just wind and solar, and that the community aspect of this equation needs to be focused on rather than the global aspect, that each community is going to tackle these situations in a different way, and that imposing solutions from the international level down or the national level down is often going to backfire. And so that's sort of the approach that the book takes. And I've got 2 more months of the book tour over the next few months, and really have seen a positive response. But really at the end of the day on the book tour, what it's shown me is that people are ready for a different environmental movement, and people are ready for an environmental movement that is cross-partisan, that is a competition of ideas, that is focused on some of the principles that are outlined in the book, and that this could be one of those issues that helps bring America together, heal the partisan divide, but also tackle a very critical challenge in climate change and the reality that we need to do that in a way that benefits humanity and doesn't just save the environment, that both of those are need to be together to get the best results. So one of the reasons why I decided to do this as more of a fireside chat, and I'll stop talking in about 20 seconds, is that there's nothing more annoying than hearing someone talk to you over Zoom for a long period of time. So I really want this to be interactive, and I hope this is a unique enough approach where you have questions, and we'll make this more of a free-flowing dialogue and hopefully very helpful for all of us. And I'd love to hear your perspectives as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Carrie, and then we will open it up for discussion.
Right, there's a couple of questions already, so thank you all very much.
Good.
I think I'll just start with a simple one myself. I think you slightly touched on it, but maybe just can clarify and expand. I mean, it's sort of the title of your book, Conservative Environmentalist, so which sort of implies there's another kind of environmentalist, and you're kind of alluding to it, but what would be the, I don't know, the definitions of something that's conservative environmentalist in this sense, whether you have to have both words or if it's just the word conservative versus the other one. He mentioned markets. Is it just conservative likes markets more and liberal likes regulation more? And
well, I think traditionally that's true. Like I got active in conservative politics when I was living in the John McCain Obama campaign years, and the conservative movement then is a lot different than the conservative movement now. So I don't necessarily say that markets or regulation have a specific home these days. Both sides seem to embrace it when it's convenient for them. But yeah, I mean, I think the conservative approach here is coming from that traditionally fiscal conservative approach, which is that the government needs to be involved, but rather than seeing it as the first resort, seeing it as the last resort. So my approach is basically flipping the topic on its head and to say that the free market or companies or innovation, entrepreneurs, those people should be leaned on first to solve these challenges, because there is an innovation gap, there is a technology gap, it does need to be affordable, and with that, there needs to be better technology. So that should be the first resort. The next resort should be local government, then state government, then federal government. And so it's not saying that the federal government doesn't play a role. It absolutely does, and especially to spur some of that innovation. I completely align with that way of thinking. But when we think about climate, the first thought is always like, what government mandate are we going to put into place? What government regulation are we going to put into place? And as we've seen with certain countries and states like Germany or California, that often backfires in terms of emissions, energy prices, and really ends up hurting the environment more than it helps. But there's, of course, examples of the government benefiting the environment as well. So it's a balance there that I think needs to be struck. So that's one difference. Another difference is, I think what we say, and I would say both sides are starting to embrace this, is in any or all the above energy strategy, that right now we have a growing energy demand that I'm sure everyone here knows about, and that you're not going to be able to meet that without nuclear, without natural gas, and maybe without even coal, which is really, a sad kind of reality that we're living through right now, where people are reopening every energy facility that they can to meet that demand, whether that's a nuclear facility or a coal facility. So we're much more we're much more open about what energy sources we use. And it kind of goes back to that reality that we need to protect the environment, but we also need to protect humanity. And what I mean by that is people's energy prices have to be low enough where they can afford them. People's decisions in their day-to-day lives cannot be made harder by the solutions that we present. We need to make being pro-environment something that people can integrate into their lives seamlessly. I think back to like that BlackBerry movie, if you guys saw that over the last year or two, and how like BlackBerry failed and the iPhone took over. The iPhone didn't take over the BlackBerry because people were told that they needed to have an iPhone. The iPhone took over the BlackBerry because for the same price, you were getting a significantly better experience, product efficiency. When you think of human behavior, that's how human behavior changes. People aren't going to pay more and be less efficient, or pay more and have their lives be more difficult just to save the environment. And we shouldn't expect people to do that. And that's why I think this kind of any of the above energy strategy, leaning on innovation and markets, those are the sorts of things that can bring more people into the dialogue rather than make it seem like it's the top down, elitist. And it can really bring in low-income communities in urban areas, but also low-income communities in rural areas, which is most of the developing world. And that's the only way that we tackle this challenge. So those are some of the fundamental disagreements. And I don't know if necessarily the other side hasn't embraced that to some degree, but there are parts of it that are definitely less popular of what I just talked about. And I like to think that that's realistic, but like the way that I was just talking about, but of course, you know, people would disagree with that too.
Right. Debating, I'm going to try to ask a short follow-up before I go to the questions, which I shouldn't do so we can get to them. But there's your government first resort, or shouldn't be first resort, should be last resort, is the idea, or the sort of the notion that the federal government's the issue of the US dollar, and so can induce people to install things like solar panels or carbon capture, who knows what, through things like the IRA by essentially choosing how they spend and not being restricted by tax loads. Is that, or how does that sit with you, that the federal government has this sort of ability that the state and local governments don't have? So if you say, I want state and local government to do it, but the federal government has this kind of extra superpower, if you will.
And that's where I think the federal government does have a role for coming in. And that's why there's a lot of, I talk about in the book how supportive I am and the organization is of a lot of the measures in the Inflation Reduction Act. A really cool fact of the Inflation Reduction Act, no matter how you feel about it, is that over 80% of the bills that were packaged together to become the Inflation Reduction Act basically was like a concoction of a bunch of bills, dozens of bills. 80% of those bills were introduced by Republicans and Democrats. So it passed on very partisan lines, but the ideas in there did represent a majority of Americans, because when both sides represented, it represents both sides of their interests. So that's why I like a lot of the principles within it, because it's not just a heavy hammer approach. It's an incentive. Like the government's role, I think, should be incentivizing rather than mandating. And I don't think the IRA is perfect, and I do think there are some missing pieces there. And I think that it over fixates on certain solutions like solar and wind and EVs rather than thinking about a wider array of solutions. But there's a lot of really good parts about it. And I would say that the reason that happened is because it was so bipartisan before it became partisan, but because it was so bipartisan and it wasn't about regulation, it was about incentivizing innovation. And that's the role the government should have. But as I talk about in the book, the only flaw to that is that sometimes the government will incentivize something and keep incentivizing it when the market just can't come up with a long-term solution. And basically the technology or whatever it's subsidizing has proven that it just won't work at the scale that people want it to, at the cost that they want it to, without the government keeping it afloat for eternity. And I do think there has to be a breaking point where the government says, okay, we tried this, we invested in it, we gave it a shot. It's okay. We're not going to strike on everything, I mean, if you know anything about like venture funds, they're not trying to get 10 out of 10 success stories in terms of the businesses they invest in. The government doesn't need to have that thought process either. Get a couple right, get a couple wrong, but don't just keep subsidizing something into eternity. And I think that's the one concern I have about the federal government doing that. But other than that, I think that approach is a lot better.
Right. Okay. Now we're really going to questions here. So this person would like to hear a bit about differences and overlaps of efforts, approaches, and viewpoints between your organization, ACC, and the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. There seem to be some strong similarities, but what are your thoughts on, I don't know, similarities and differences, or how you overlap and work together?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'm surprised people know about either organization. So thank you for asking that question. I would say there's just to break down the conservative climate ecosphere. On the left, you have, and I'm overgeneralizing here, but like you have $10 billion of NGOs, which is true. Like from the Sierra Club to Audubon and there's great groups. There's a lot of great groups, but it's $10 billion of money. And there's probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of organizations. On the right, there are 5. And so the question is coming about a group called C3 Solutions. And what's really cool about the right of center space, other than it is trying to build the political bridge, and we work really well with all the left of center allies, is that we all kind of do our own thing. So ACC is, and that all those things are complementary. So ACC is grassroots. We're trying to show elected leaders that people in real America, like outside of DC, have a really important viewpoint on these topics. And that they should listen to them. So we have members and activists across the country. We have an ACC Austin chapter, for example. We do advocacy initiatives in education, and we do DC work, but our power comes from our grassroots network. Whereas C3 Solutions is one of a few amazing organizations in DC that is focused on kind of like more of the policy side of things and more like the think tank white papers, breaking down costs of different things and analyzing different policies. They have somewhat of a comms component, but it's not as big of a thing. I think they have their own podcast. But basically the difference is they're more policy think tank heavy and we're more grassroots.
Great. Another question, do we need to use common political terms like your terms you use, right of center or conservative, when we discuss the environment? Or can we talk about what is helpful, what is harmful, what is wasteful, polluting, or restorative and clean, and these kinds of words, which may not be, may not be so politicky. They're just kind of. I
love that question got asked, because I think it's a critical one, and it's important that people think about that. The reason why I still use the book title, The Conservative Environmentalist, the reason why I talk about it in that way is because we have to normalize the fact that you can be a conservative and be an environmentalist, because everyone is thinking in very political terms these days. When they think of environmentalists, they think of liberal. You don't have to say you're a liberal environmentalist. It's kind of implied. Unfortunately, I consider myself an environmentalist, so I don't abide by that. But why we use that is to say, hey, if you're a right of center person, you can be an environmentalist. If you're a right of center person, you can join an organization that believes in your values. It's more to normalize those things rather than to say, oh, this is only for conservatives who care about the environment. Like that's not the approach. And I can see why people would think of it that way, because until we get past the polarization of the topic, we can't talk about solutions. So those other principles that you listed in the question, you can't talk about the areas of agreement if you don't think you can agree in the first place. And I'm about to launch a nonprofit called Nature is Nonpartisan, which is I'm going to co-found with a left of center co-founder. And really the goal is to normalize that you can have these conversations across the political spectrum and actually convene elected officials and leaders to find solutions. But no one really thinks that's possible yet. So we're trying to break down those social barriers, and ideally you don't have to use those words in the future, but right now no conservative would listen to a quote unquote environmentalist because they'd automatically assume they are liberal. And we're trying to show that that is not necessarily the case, and that this is something that both sides can authentically be part of.
Right. Okay, here's a question with I guess a little bit of a Texas ask or flair. What have you learned? It says from other conservative states, but you might mention any state or anywhere you've been traveling around. So what have you learned from other conservative states about strategy and communications and how it can be utilized in Texas, and what's particularly with your organization? Is there anything particular going on in Texas with your chapter here?
Yeah, great question. The two states that I point to that I think are doing a great job are Wyoming and Georgia. Wyoming is governed by a Republican named Mark Gordon, and Georgia's Republican governor is Brian Kemp. And they have a few common similarities. One is that they are saying if you're a clean energy business or a technology around anything related to energy, you're welcome in our state. So you're seeing the EV manufacturing hubs and carbon capture facilities, solar facilities, wind facilities. The largest wind facility is being built in Wyoming right now. The first next generation nuclear plant is being built in Wyoming. The largest EV manufacturing hub is being built in Georgia. I believe one of the largest, if not the largest, solar community is being built or has been built in Georgia. So they're basically saying we're lowering the barriers of entry. We're not going to make it difficult to do business here. And we want your jobs and we want you to be in our state. Now, because it's not just a climate message, it's also about jobs and economic opportunity and helping people get, part of this kind of next generation energy movement. You're getting buy-in from both sides. So you have Democratic legislators working with the Republican governor because of climate and other related concerns. And then the Republicans in the state legislature are working on it for different reasons, like, energy independence and more job opportunities and more economic growth for the state. So they're coming at it from different angles, but it's working. And I think that that's something that Texas could employ. One of the issues I see with Texas is a similar issue that I see in California, but just on the flip side, which is picking a winner and loser in the energy race. Obviously, oil and gas is critical to the state of Texas, and that's an important reality to balance. But shaming and kind of pushing down solar and wind and other clean energy sources is, in my opinion, pretty backwards and not good for the state. And similarly to California, it kind of just makes everything harder. And I think Wyoming and Georgia are doing a good job of straddling that balance. So that actually leads into what we're doing in Texas, which is preventing a shift towards an anti-energy mindset. And by anti-energy, I mean anti-clean energy mindset. And so we have our chapters advocating for kind of that any or all of the above mindset. So when there's a bill and we helped block a policy that would have really hurt wind and solar in the state, that we're actively supporting the different industries that will help us decarbonize, but also produce more energy.
All right, thank you. You maybe slightly touched on this, but so maybe don't have to say much more. How do you square the idea of less government and market principles with a desire for nuclear development, which has been historically mostly government deployed or at least funded, and I don't know, loan programs or who knows what. There's a tax credit for nuclear still, if people build them. But in Texas, for one thing, the governor is pushing to be a new small modular reactor kind of hub here in Texas. So that's at least one thing. But any other thoughts on the role of government and nuclear that you like or don't like? Or what's needed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, well, first of all, nuclear is critical to solving the challenge that we face. We can't solve climate change without nuclear energy, and nuclear is absolutely critical. I'm a huge supporter of it. The government has been supportive of it in some ways, but I actually think that that is a misconception, especially in the past few decades. of nuclear, and I'll go into that. So nuclear actually, like in France and in the United Arab Emirates and other countries, they can build nuclear plants within like 5 years and do it very safely. Our government basically triples the time because we have so many regulations and regulatory barriers that were set up almost a half century ago, that it make it nearly impossible to build a nuclear plant in the United States. And so it becomes far more expensive and time consuming and harder on the taxpayers, because we are putting so many restrictions in place. Like if you look at what happened in Georgia, which is the most recent nuclear plant to be built in the United States, the company, Southern Company, is a utility, which right now utilities are really the only companies that can afford a traditional nuclear reactor to build. They didn't have a ton of government help. They actually relied on kind of raising energy prices for their ratepayers, the people who are having the energy. But the problem with it is that they ran into so many legal and regulatory barriers that it cost them so much more than they had expected. And so everyone blames them for being so expensive. But in another country, that wouldn't have happened. And I think that that's something we should be looking at addressing, is how can we be supportive of nuclear and also make sure it's safe without being overwhelmingly regulatory, like past the point of what's necessary. And we have definitely passed that point. The good news is, regardless of that, next generation nuclear is on the rise, and the first next generation nuclear plant to be built is under construction finally, in Wyoming. So that could be irrelevant in the future. The traditional reactors that are much more time intensive to build, they're way bigger and they have much more traditional technology. However, with the demand for energy being what it is and next generation nuclear kind of being unknown, we don't really have proof of it yet. We might need to build more traditional reactors, and other countries are doing that. So if we're going to do that, we have to streamline the government's role, and make it easier for nuclear to do business, and not have it take 15 years and triple the cost.
Right, here's one on, I guess, current presidential politics with the debate happening tonight. I guess the question here is saying that former President Trump says he's committed to withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. I guess he did it the first time. And reversing some of the current administration's climate policy. So the question is, do you engage with the presidential elections or nominees, or maybe any level? Does ACC, you see its role as engaging with this kind of discussion or trying to influence candidates?
Yeah, well, it's a really important question too. I mean, these are all really critical questions. I am definitely not a fan of Trump's approach on climate. To me, it seems like something that he is just doing to be against what the left is for, which is what both sides tend to do these days, where they're just, whatever one side says, we're going to do the opposite. I've talked to a lot of the people on his team, and they kind of get this issue, but they see the political advantage of being anti-Kamala, anti-Biden, anti-Obama, throughout the last 8 years. So I do have a problem with it, and I think that that's like just what I want to say to start with. We do not endorse presidential candidates, or we haven't. I think maybe if there were better options, we'd consider it. I have not voted for Trump in either election, to be candid. I have voted third party, and I feel like our generation has felt really frustrated by the way that the presidential system has worked. I know people in our organization have voted for Trump, and people have voted for the Democrats too. Like we have a very diverse team in terms of people's political views. But the way I look at it is that regardless of who wins, we need action on this stuff, and we will work with whoever wins. And Donald Trump has said that he wants to reduce emissions for the first time in this election cycle. He released talking points before the last debate about how reducing emissions and expanding energy are not mutually exclusive, and that he wants to do both. He's been supportive of nuclear energy. He's been hammering solar and wind less. And so I'm not trying to defend his stance on the issue, but I do think that it is the tone is changing, and regardless of who wins, I think we'll have opportunity to act, because there is, outside of Trump, a very growing bipartisan consensus in Congress and in state legislatures where you can make action happen, even if our national presidential politics are a shit show.
Right. Okay, it's kind of a high level. The next two are kind of high level questions. One, can you say more or anything specific? Climate change is a global problem. Your organization seems, I guess, focused on the United States, and you're trying to focus on private actors. So the question's sort of implying, you know, how much can privatized local or privatized U.S. actions influence the global climate? Or do you see it as just, well, this is the role of ACC, and if you get more people on board in the U.S., then great, but you're not at the global scale. You're not the global CC.
Well, what we've been talking about as an organization, the thing we often say is think global, act local. And so, yes, it's a global concern, but the way that Arizona, where I live now, tackles the challenge is very different than Seattle, where I lived for the last 6 years. Completely different geographies, completely different climates, completely different resources, completely different economies, completely different income levels. You know, these are very different scenarios, and so you can't expect a country like Indonesia to tackle it in the same way as Norway. And I think that's the main thought, is that you also can't, you know, expect the city of Chicago to solve it in the same way as a really rural town 4 hours south in Illinois. Like, there are different realities. And so, yes, there's a global aspect of it that is undeniable. But until you can prove that different parts of the world and the country can be a part of the solution in their own way, people are never going to do it, because it has to be, again, integratable into their lives. And that's why, like, empowering local stakeholders to make the right decisions, and it does add up. It's like, you know, it's like voting, except on steroids. It's even better than voting, because it's not like you have billions of people making those decisions. You have probably millions of people making local decisions. The more local decisions you have being made in the right direction, the more that those can be replicated elsewhere. And they have a pretty sizable impact. Like Arizona, for example, is now leading the world in like desert ecosystem water efficiency. And because they invested on a local scale, it wasn't the government coming in here and saying, you need to do this. There are plenty of other desert towns like Las Vegas and Los Angeles and others. Like, now that those ideas are being spread around the world to Dubai and other places that aren't even the United States. So there is a way to, again, think global and act local that still addresses the global nature of the challenge.
All right, big scale question again. I guess I'll just read it instead of interpret it. Capitalism and environmentalism are inherently in conflict. If you propose we don't rely on government solutions for environmental problems, how will firms be incentivized to innovate? And currently, there is not much of a profit to be made. And historically, innovation of the scale that we need now and, say, clean energy technologies has been possible because of government subsidies and programs. So how do we weigh the market versus the role of government to shape markets or incentivize, given particularly we don't have a carbon tax, even though conservative groups push for it? Sure. It hasn't happened.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I would say, and first of all, let me just take a break to say these questions are amazing, and these are really tough, great questions, and this is exactly what I was hoping for. So thank you, everyone, for submitting them. I hope, unlike most politicians, I'm answering them directly. That's my goal. So if I'm not, please call me out on it. Capitalism and environmentalism, I would say, were inherently in conflict, and there's still traces of that. But capitalism created the energy abundance that we have today, which allowed us to even be able to talk to each other on Zoom right now. With every technology that capitalism or whatever creates, there are trade-offs, just like there's trade-offs to solar or There's trade-offs to cell phones. There's trade-offs to everything that we do. And the goal of capitalism then is to solve those trade-offs, to create businesses and innovations that limit the trade-offs. And that's the way I see it. It's not to say that capitalism hasn't created environmental harm in many ways. It's to say that capitalism can also solve most of those challenges. And the reason why I know that that's true, and the reason that I think that that's a big part of the solution, I'm not saying it's the only solution, is because the countries that are reducing emissions the fastest are the countries that have the most free economies. Actually, the group that Trevor asked a question about earlier with C3 Solutions, they've done a bunch of reports, but even independent groups like the IEA and others have shown that as countries' emissions are going down, it's because of the ability to do business and create cool technologies and things that make things more efficient. And the government has a role, like I said earlier, in spurring some of that innovation. But as Elon Musk and other innovators can attest to, obviously he grew Tesla in a very subsidized world, but he didn't really utilize those subsidies in the way that the other companies did, and yet he came up with the most superior at this point in time electric vehicle product. And he credits that, before he was all political and divisive, he credited the ability to just innovate and create here in the United States that made it possible, and that it actually wasn't really the subsidies, and he wished that the subsidies weren't even there. So again, I'm not saying that the subsidies shouldn't have been there. The point is, when you have innovators and entrepreneurs, you can solve really complex challenges. Of course, pollution in the atmosphere is a trade-off that is a collective trade-off that we all need to address, and so the federal government has a role in that. But I would not argue that the government is better suited to solve climate challenges. I do believe that capitalism is a massive part of that equation.
I guess on your subsidies comments there's a comment here about you support ending subsidies for fossil fuels.
I think if we stop, I would be down to, I'm pro subsidies for fossil fuels if it is focused on reducing emissions from fossil fuels, because we are going to continue using fossil fuels, and that's not changing anytime soon, especially in developing countries. Even the IPCC report basically says that without making fossil fuels more efficient, we're not going to meet our targets. We need to figure out how to lower, like if you could lower the emissions of coal or natural gas by 10%, that reduces carbon emissions from those power plants by 10%. That's a significant chunk. If it's 40%, that's even better. Like there's not going to be some silver bullet solution that gets us there. So I think that could be subsidized, but I do believe that there are many examples, including the fossil fuels, of subsidies being out of date. And we need to figure out how to basically review what we're subsidizing and see, is that really necessary? Or are we just putting more money in people's back pockets that don't need that from us? And that it's actually not spurring any innovation.
All right, here's one more on a policy front, or at least I guess, conservative climate group, Citizens Climate Lobby, and the idea of the carbon fee and dividend. You or American Conservation Coalition have a stance on that, or see something like that as a good idea, but people are trying it, so you focus on something else, or how do you see this effort?
Yeah, so similar to Trump and Harris, on our team, we have a very diverse group of people who think that it's a great idea and people who don't think it's a great idea, which I think speaks to the reason why it hasn't happened yet, which is that both sides have a portion that like it, and both sides have a portion that don't like it. Democrats on the far left don't think it's going far enough. Moderate Democrats like it. Moderate Republicans tend to like it. And then farther, right conservatives don't like the fact that it's a tax and goes against their, anti-tax principles, and that they're taxing something that is just going to put America at a disadvantage. So there's obviously a varying degree of support and on both sides. And I personally think that eventually we should get to that solution. I do think that it's a negative externality that needs to be accounted for. However, the first step, I think, to getting to that would be a border carbon adjustment to tax the countries that have even higher emissions per energy source produced than us. This is going to sound like defending of the fossil fuel industry here, but we do produce fossil fuels at a much more efficient and less carbon intensive way than other countries. Those countries need to be put in their place for that, specifically China and Venezuela and some of our adversaries, that both sides could get behind that idea. I think if we could see that that works and that it doesn't just like increase costs for everyone, that it would be easier to justify a carbon tax, carbon price. What I would like to do, and I think the way to make it bipartisan, would be to say, okay, we're going to price it at this level, but we're also going to distribute that money back to taxpayers rather than just increase the size of government. Because the worry that people have about the carbon price is that it increases the price of gas or the price of, utilizing fossil fuels that people need to use on a day-to-day basis, and that it puts low-income people at risk of being even more difficult to make ends meet. So if you could promise that that really wouldn't happen, I think it would be a lot easier.
Right. I guess that's the citizens' climate lobby approach, is that they can prevent the low income impact by distributing the dividends appropriately.
Yep.
So here's one. I guess just read it instead of try to interpret it incorrectly. So I agree, climate adaptation and mitigation is best handled at smaller and regional local scales than, large scales, to be specific to a region's needs or whatever's going on locally. But the central antagonizer is carbon emissions, and those are probably not going to be abated on a local scale. At the scale needed to deal with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So can you speak more on how national and international climate initiatives, their quote here, quote, backfire, you can interpret that, and what is a better alternative to get so many different approaches to the same end goal? So maybe this is just sort of, you have the magic recipe for getting more local people to engage in enough efforts that matter at a large scale, or at least not oppose large efforts.
Yeah, another really important question. I would say, per my comment earlier, I agree that it's a global issue and that it needs to be solved with global cooperation. We go to the United Nations COP every year, and I definitely think that international cooperation is important. But I'll give two examples. So the first example is the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords were goals, right, which are somewhat arbitrary, and the United States was on track, at least last time I checked, to meet those goals more than other countries were, without even being in it for a while. And so I agree that like having the international cooperation is important, but the United States isn't decreasing emissions because it's in the Accords versus out of the Accords. It's meeting it because of local communities moving from coal to natural gas, from local communities installing more wind and solar, from our companies and people buying more fuel efficient vehicles. Those are the sorts of things that lower carbon emissions, not some sort of international agreement. So that's one example. The second example is also the Inflation Reduction Act, which I actually saw the other question on that, and I want to answer that too. The Inflation Reduction Act is inherently a great start for America in a lot of ways on this topic, but it's not really trackable. It's hard to identify where the funds are going. People don't really, like, all these funds are available. No one knows how to get them. No one even knows that they exist. I mean, the whole discussion in my philanthropic community is basically, how do we tell people that they even have the option to have these dollars? Like, there's a huge disconnect when the federal government passes something and how it actually gets implemented at the local level. And then how do you track the impact of that policy? And if emissions are going down, how much do you attribute to the national plan. So again, I'm being a devil's advocate to the IRA, even though I overall support it. The point is, it's hard to track, it's hard to measure, and it also tends to, even if the intention is to give local communities funding, make them feel like they don't really know what to do about it. Because you're having some person from DC say, here, we have this money for you. We need you to know that we have this money for you somehow, and we need you to deploy it, and we also don't know how to do that. So that's kind of the concern with international agreements or national policy, is that it just makes it harder to do things on the local level. Now, with the IRA question about kind of like how to change the party, I do want to hammer it home that 80% of the policies within the IRA were a bipartisan. Like, if those bills were introduced individually, 80% of them would have passed on bipartisan lines. The problem with it was that it was a concoction of dozens of bills that were hundreds and hundreds of pages, and they didn't just have to do with climate, they had to do with healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and there also was an election year that neither side wanted to give each other a win, which is why the left introduced it in a 100% partisan way through reconciliation. They didn't even give Republicans a chance to put their input in it. And of course, Republicans, there are a lot of Republicans who agree with most of it that didn't vote for it because they didn't want to give Democrats a win. So I actually hate that that's used as an example of where Republicans aren't making progress today, when there are dozens of examples of bills passing that are on climate, like the Growing Climate Solutions Act, the Clean Energy Act of 2020, a lot of the bills within the IRA. There is a shift happening, but because of the IRA, people think that there isn't. And I would just argue that that's not true, and that things are happening more quickly. But to answer the question, how do you get Republicans to change? Republicans have to change by knowing that their voters care about it and that their voters will benefit. So our job is to show that their voters actually do care about it, especially younger voters. But their communities need to know that they're also going to benefit by these policies. Otherwise, they're going to feel like their livelihoods are being, taken from them. And so our goal is to also show conservative communities that a lot of these climate policies will actually end up benefiting them, and not make them change their entire lives just to, quote unquote, save the planet, when they are fearful that, quote unquote, saving the planet is going to kill their own communities and kill their livelihoods.
Right. I think you've answered one of these questions about what you or a conservative environmentalists do to bring more of the conservative denying crowd into the active part of the solution. I'll mention here, would maybe not ask the questions, and I'll give you these links. I'll download the questions and give them to you when we're done here, but try to finish up with one or two more questions. But there's a couple here about nuclear red tape and nuclear costs overruns, referring to MIT studies and the French plant that's coming on this year in Flamanville that started in 2007. So questions about whether how many other countries can do it faster. At least France is one example.
Yeah.
Let's see.
What
maybe
was the
ahead.
question you wanted me to answer? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, I was just mentioning some thoughts here without actually answering the question. So
Okay.
recognizing the people's questions online without that are responding to your comments already. Here's a maybe kind of a mixed question from myself and some that are here. Some about I guess your organization's focused on the United States, but there's questions about developing countries and how much these kind of ideas translate to developing countries or not. I'll ask a little bit of how do you, it's similar, but it's still about the United States. Potential conflicts between, I'll just stereotype, conservative, at least the rural areas, and infrastructure. If we're having more wind, solar, and transmission, this is a little bit more infrastructure in rural areas, let's say. I mean, that's pretty much going to happen, or offshore, and we're getting pushback on offshore wind in the Northeast from an environmental standpoint of whaling and whales, these kinds of things. So are y'all focused any on this, or how do you see this kind of, I don't know, land use conflict and more infrastructure on the energy side? And yeah, how do you deal with that?
Well, I think, first of all, people who care about this I would urge them to go to some of these communities and have these conversations with them, because I've gone to like Midland, Texas, and coal plants in Utah, coal communities in Utah, coal communities in West Virginia, farming communities in the Midwest, and understanding their fears and their concerns, but also what they need is really critical. And like, I think bridging the urban rural divide on this topic is almost more critical and plays into building the bridge between the conservative and liberal communities. The main thing is that people don't want to be told what to do. No one wants to be told what to do in America on either political side. And being told what to do by somebody in an urban area that doesn't necessarily understand the way that rural people live. I grew up across the street from a dairy farm, but I grew up in fairly suburban like lifestyle, and I didn't understand until I kind of started going to some of these communities. I still don't understand to the same degree, of course, what they need. And we have to be cognizant of how to make them part of the solution, because most of the developing world is low income rural communities. So if it can't work for low income rural communities here, it's not going to work for low income communities there that, by, all things equal, have even less money than the low income communities here. So we have to be cognizant of that, and like create solutions that don't just work for our tech savvy urban lives, but also for the people who provide the resources for us, the farmers, the ranchers, the energy providers, etc. So a perfect example of that, knowing that we have limited time, is just, there's a company that came up with a solution for turning cow poop into natural, like clean natural gas, cleaner natural gas than normal, just natural gas. And they are providing an extra income stream for farmers to take a byproduct of what they already have, something that they don't need, and they're creating energy from it, but they're also benefiting the farmers. So they call it poop to power, which isn't very sexy, but it's a really cool idea of like how you can work with rural communities in a way that benefits them, but also benefits the climate challenge without telling them what to do. Because chances are, if we're telling them what to do, we don't actually know what's possible.
Oh, right. Poop to power, cow power. We've had papers published here on that, UT Austin as well. So maybe we'll end with this one here, which is kind of a question about the goals or measures of success of your organization, American Conservation Coalition. So how do you know you've done a good job, or can you point to things where you felt like you had an impact, or too soon to tell, or just these kinds of things? How would you know you've done a great job?
Well, I'm very biased, but I think we've done an amazing job. It hasn't been perfect, but when we started, there were no Republicans in Congress or there are 2 Republicans in Congress who addressed climate change as being a reality. Now there's over 150 between the House and the Senate. For the first time in my lifetime, there have been bipartisan climate policies passed, and it's only heading in the right direction. It does not return to where it was before. Per some of the comments in the chat, I totally understand that there are some shortfalls and shortcomings for sure that are undeniable, but the progress is also undeniable, and it's not going to get there overnight. We've made, like I said, 2 to 150 in Congress is just one example of the shift that has happened. Fox News has people on, including me, that talk about climate change. Donald Trump is not out there denying it like he was in 2016 and 2020. Like there are changes being made that are really positive, and the more that we grow, the more more that the people who are skeptical are taking us seriously, and we're not going to stop anytime soon. And if you're liberal or in the middle or on the right, if you care about this topic, we need to succeed, because there's no way to do it without half the country or half the world, and that's what we're trying to solve.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll end there. So it's been Benji Backer, founder and executive chairman of the American Conservation Coalition, of course, author of this book, The Conservative Environmentalist. Thank you for joining us here for the University of Texas Energy Symposium.
Yeah, thanks everyone for jumping on. I really appreciate all the questions, and please stay in touch. Would love to be of assistance going forward, and the work you're doing is critical. So please follow me and tell me about the projects you're working on, and we'll stay in touch.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, Benji. Have a good day.
Thanks all.